Ever wonder why your Power Automate flows suddenly stop or SharePoint refuses to play nice with large lists? You're not the only one. Today, we'll break down the hidden ways M365 service limits can quietly wreck even your smartest cloud solutions before you see a single warning. Get ready to see how exceeding a limit in one corner of Microsoft 365 can spark issues everywhere else. Stick around because I'll show you the essential strategies you need to work with these limits, not against them. The domino effect, how one limit can wreck your whole M365 workflow. If you've ever fixed an annoying SharePoint list problem and thought you were done, only to find your Power Automate flows quietly failing a few hours later, you know the frustration. It feels random, like the system's conspiring against you. But what's really happening is a ripple effect inside Microsoft 365 that Microsoft doesn't exactly highlight in big red letters. One tiny limit tucked away in SharePoint can kick off issues across Teams, the Power Platform, and Graph API. It's all invisible until a tool you rely on stops working for reasons you don't see coming. Here's what a lot of admins miss. M365 services look like modular blocks, but the truth is they're tightly connected. Hitting one service's limit rarely stays contained to that service. It might sound dramatic, but it works a bit like a domino chain. Let's say you hit a SharePoint threshold. Suddenly, it's not just SharePoint grumbling. That single pain point triggers a string of failures in your automations, Teams channels, or even in the backend Graph API calls that tie everything together. Most people approach these service caps in isolation. They search for Teams limits if they're having a Teams problem or wonder about SharePoint when lists are misbehaving. Nobody talks about what happens when boundaries overlap. For instance, if you're right up against the cap for Teams membership and keep adding users, you'll notice strange behavior in other places. Suddenly, invites aren't landing, files don't sync the way you expect. And in the background, calls to Graph API start getting throttled, not just for Teams, but for every workload that touches Graph. It doesn't help that Microsoft's documentation is separated by product, so the warning signs don't always line up. Take a real example. An enterprise rolls out a huge SharePoint list, hundreds of thousands of items, lots of moving parts. They've built out a nice Power Automate flow to update items overnight, push notifications, and drive a sleek reporting dashboard. Everything looks solid for a few weeks. Then, without warning, the flow slowdowns start. Reports hang or time out. End users get impatient and the support tickets roll in. The SharePoint interface sputters, but nobody's talking about the connector limits until Power Automate suddenly fails quietly. It's not obvious at first because the root cause is buried in SharePoint's 5,000 item view threshold. The threshold acts as a silent wall. If your view tries to pull more than 5,000 items without proper indexing, SharePoint doesn't say no nicely, it just slows to a crawl or refuses to fetch data. Power Automate, which depends on being able to read all those items, can't explain why it's timing out. Suddenly, your automation isn't just delayed, sometimes it's dead in the water with nothing more than a cryptic error for company. Now let's look at Teams. Imagine an organization pushing the envelope with massive project teams, thousands of users at a time. The out-of-the-box limits sound massive, up to 10,000 users per team, hundreds of channels and more. But in practice, you run into strange, quiet failures long before Microsoft's stated cap. One morning, you're provisioning a fresh team for a leadership demo, adding users en masse when things quietly stall. New memberships don't stick. Compliance policies stop syncing, even though the interface doesn't complain. As you retrace your steps, you might notice your tenant's Graph API call volume peaking at the same time. Suddenly, Graph API starts returning rate limit exceeded responses, not only for Teams, but also for other services that share the same wrapper. What begins with Teams membership quietly escalates into platform-wide throttling right when your live demo is set to start. Even the Microsoft Service Health Dashboard and Admin Center alerts can miss these overlaps. The documentation likes to describe each limit as if it lives alone. If you read the fine print, you'll find all sorts of in addition to standard limits and may affect other operations caveats. What's missing is any real guidance about how these things trigger each other. The Admin Center focuses on what it can directly measure, so subtle cross-service slowdowns often escape notice until the user impact is already high. The real catch is most admins get blindsided because these dependencies remain hidden. You only learn about their existence after something snaps. By the time users are complaining, the real root cause might have started days or even weeks before, back when a single list started creeping over its safe threshold or a team got just a few users too many. Solving these issues isn't just about fixing what broke in the moment. It's about recognizing the signals early, tracing minor slowdowns, unexpected error logs, and small mismatches in user access across different apps. When you see the whole system as a web of limits instead of isolated boundaries, you uncover trouble before it avalanches. And that's the key, spotting the warning signs before they mushroom into widespread downtime. You start to notice patterns like workloads taking just a bit longer or flows running in batches instead of all at once. It's not just about being paranoid, it's about reading the clues before they spell disaster at scale. Now that we've pulled back the curtain on how a single overlooked limit can trigger problems across your M365 tenant, it's worth asking, how do we avoid these traps in the first place? Next, let's break down what it actually takes to build SharePoint lists that keep your workflows smooth and don't secretly sabotage your Power Platform projects. Building SharePoint lists that don't set traps for Power Platform. If you've worked with SharePoint lists for more than 5 minutes, you've probably heard someone mention the 5,000 item view threshold like it's some kind of mythical monster. The truth is that number isn't just a warning label, it's a trap waiting for almost every team that grows beyond spreadsheets. And what catches most people off guard is not just the limit itself, but how easy it is to stumble into a mess with the default settings. Let's talk about what usually happens. You start with a clean, empty SharePoint list. It grows steadily. Dozens of users pile in, each adding their own items, sometimes thousands at a time, especially when you're importing data or connecting to legacy systems. On paper, SharePoint can handle those numbers just fine. You look at the documentation and see that the technical max is in the millions for list items. So the obvious conclusion, we're good for the long haul. Fast forward a few planning cycles, a dashboard is built on top of that list using Power BI or embedded into Teams, and 3 months down the road, the dashboard that once loaded instantly now lags. Users complain about slow searches and page loading. Worse, the Power Automate flows you connected for notifications or record updates start timing out with no clear errors in sight. You escalate the issue, but all you get is vague advice about adjusting your views, nothing about how your entire automation strategy is held hostage by this single threshold. The reality is, SharePoint's out-of-the-box architecture often lulls users into a false sense of security. Most lists are created with the default settings, a flat structure, no mind paid to column indexes, and a single list doing the heavy lifting for every report or workflow. For a while, that approach works. The platform is fast, your users are happy, and new features roll out with minimal friction. Then thresholds sneak up, and suddenly the familiar list becomes the choke point for all your data-driven processes. What's actually happening is deceptively simple. SharePoint fetches up to 5,000 items at a time when creating a view or running an operation. If you ask for more than that without special configuration, it clogs. This hits hardest when you try to aggregate or filter large data sets, or when Power Automate tries a bulk lookup. Flows that depend on querying the full list start timing out with cryptic error messages, leaving you guessing. And the bigger problem? These failures rarely point you in the right direction. You'll see nondescript failures or performance drops. Rarely do you get the classic "you hit the view threshold" red flag. Instead, Power Platform logs a failure, but there's no link back to what needs to be fixed at the SharePoint level. The biggest mistake is relying on those default settings. It's tempting to treat your new project like an Excel file where a single sheet holds everything. But SharePoint isn't built for massive flat files with dozens of concurrent access patterns. Trying to force a warehouse of activity logs, contracts, tasks, and metadata into a single megalist is almost a guarantee you'll cross that 5,000 item view threshold sooner than expected. And when you do, it's not just the list that's affected. Every workflow, dashboard, and alert connected to that list starts exhibiting strange behaviors at the same time. So how do you outsmart the trap? The answer is baked into the platform, but you have to go looking for it. Indexed columns are your first line of defense. By setting indexes on the fields, you regularly filter and sort by. You can keep SharePoint snappy and responsive, even as your list grows past 5,000 items. Filtered views are just as important. Instead of trying to show all records at once, default to views that include only the items users actually care about, like open tasks, current year projects, or recently modified entries. Microsoft's own best practices point out that combining column indexing with filtered views can sidestep almost all the big performance pitfalls. If your data really does need to stay in a single place, organizing with folders can help as well. Folders break a massive list into manageable chunks that each sit safely under the threshold. A lot of organizations learn this lesson the hard way. Let's look at one company that had a list used for tracking help desk tickets. It ballooned to more than 60,000 items in a year, and every Monday morning, the Power Automate flows responsible for weekly reporting froze without warning. The IT team was stuck firefighting until they broke up their list by creating a new one for each calendar year, added indexes to the status and assigned to fields, and rewrote their views to always filter by open tickets. The change was immediate. Flows completed on time, dashboards refreshed instantly, and support tickets plummeted. What seemed like a capacity problem turned out to be all about list design and configuration. There's also the matter of Power Platform connector limits. These determine not just how many calls you can make from flows to SharePoint, but how well those calls perform. From day one, plan your integrations with connector thresholds in mind, limit batch sizes, space out triggers, and avoid one giant get items action that pulls your whole list every hour. If you build with these patterns from the start, you don't find yourself scrambling to redesign everything later. Optimizing your lists and enforcing connector best practices gives you a SharePoint environment that stays fast and predictable even as it scales. The best part? You spend less time cleaning up after the fact and more time actually delivering new solutions for your users. But SharePoint isn't the only service that can turn on you without warning. Teams membership brings its own set of hidden failures. Teams membership where silent failures lurk. If you've ever bulk added users to a team and everything looked fine, only to get messages days later saying users missed important conversations or couldn't access files, you felt the pain of silent failures. Teams does a nice job of hiding complexity from the average user, but for admins, it's a very different story. Underneath that friendly interface, there's a thick tangle of membership and channel limits that often go ignored right up until things start to unravel. Most people hear up to 10,000 users per team and move on. But in reality, the system wobbles long before you ever see a hard stop. The facade of simplicity is part of the issue. On the surface, adding users to a team feels no different whether you add 550 or 5,000. Microsoft's marketing language is always about how you can connect everyone. But the details buried in technical docs tell a less optimistic tale. When organizations push close to that upper membership limit, small but critical functions begin to falter. Invitations don't make it to the whole list. Files uploaded to channels go missing for certain members. Meeting scheduling hits mysterious could not be saved errors. Often users report these issues to the help desk before IT ever sees a warning in the admin center. Documentation for Teams limits exists, but it's scattered. There are hard limits around member count, number of channels, including deleted ones, oddly enough, and guest user counts. If you read the fine print, you'll notice phrases like performance may degrade as you approach the limit. But nowhere does it say exactly what will fail first or what odd behaviors to watch out for in a high-scale environment. Instead, messages just stop being delivered or files vanish from the chat history for some users while others still see them. Even when you dig into Microsoft's official troubleshooting pages, you get a series of steps for the most common symptoms, but rarely advice on preventing failures before you hit a wall. Take a real example from a mid-sized consulting firm handling a countrywide migration. Their main project team ballooned to several thousand users almost overnight as contractors, partners, and clients flooded in. Admins kept adding users, both employees and guests, using automated scripts. At first, everything seemed okay, but soon emails surfaced complaining about missing compliance policy updates. Digging deeper, the team found that teams had silently stopped syncing compliance policies and certain notifications for large chunks of the group. The membership list looked fine in the admin dashboard, yet the backend synchronization simply gave up on the overflow. There was no bright red flag, just a long tail of problems trickling downstream. One common route to trouble is using nested groups. It looks efficient at first, just add a security or Microsoft 365 group and let membership roll up. But as group nesting grows, especially when you mix in guests, your true member count can explode beyond what you realize. Even if each subgroup has only a few hundred users, the total can quickly surpass the documented limits when Teams unrolls the group objects. If you're provisioning Teams at scale, automation can make the situation worse. Scripts churn away, adding dozens or hundreds every day without any built-in monitoring for how close the limit is. Suddenly, external users can't access resources or chats don't sync, all because the underlying membership model has quietly fractured under the load. The other pattern that nearly guarantees trouble is relying heavily on guests. Teams is designed to let you bring in outside collaborators, but each guest counts the same against your limits as internal users. Heavy guest usage means you hit performance thresholds faster, and it's far less likely the admin center will warn you. Auto-provisioning tools make this worse by hiding the growing footprint. Unless you're actively tracking member stats, silent failures sneak in. Microsoft's own troubleshooting docs mention issues like channels disappear for users or members cannot access files, especially as you approach documented membership thresholds. They suggest double-checking group expansion and making sure onboarding automation is not outpacing what teams can process. Stories from organizations running large, multinational teams often sound familiar. Ghost invites, calendar integration headaches, or audit logs that refuse to load for some users but not others. What's striking in all these stories is how rarely admins connect the dots between Teams outages and membership excess. Most are too busy chasing single service errors, Teams exchange SharePoint, without pulling back to check for creeping headcount or hidden group nesting. But almost every time you see spotty access or weird drop-offs in functionality, the membership count is the culprit. With proper governance, like periodic reviews of group nesting, proactive monitoring of headcount, and tighter controls over guest invitations, you spot these time bombs early. A little extra attention to membership patterns makes all the difference. Setting alerts for sudden spikes or having regular audits of team size and channel usage catches issues before they multiply. Teams is a collaboration workhorse, but without careful oversight, it becomes ground zero for silent failures that can spread throughout your organization. So that's the membership minefield. And it brings us to the under-the-radar challenge that hammers even well-managed tenants, Graph API throttling. And this, more than any single headline limit, is where retry logic can save you or break you. Graph API throttling, outsmarting the invisible wall. If you've ever launched a new integration with Microsoft Graph API and watched it run perfectly, until one night everything goes sideways and you wake up to a pile of cryptic 429 or 503 errors, it's not just you. Graph API throttling isn't the easiest thing to spot, and Microsoft doesn't exactly broadcast when you're about to hit the wall. It usually starts with your Power Automate flows slowing down, emails not being sent, or your sync jobs repeatedly failing for reasons that make no immediate sense. The errors thrown back by Graph are rarely helpful, and most developers default to the same plan. Shrug, try again, and hope for the best. Behind the scenes, the story is a lot less random. Throttling on Graph API isn't just about protecting Microsoft's back-end resources, it's about keeping the entire M365 ecosystem fair for everyone. Every tenant shares finite bandwidth and compute. When you hit certain usage patterns, and say bursts of batch jobs, over-enthusiastic Power Automate flows, or bulk operations on Teams, Graph starts slowing you down. Sometimes these limits are well documented, other times not so much, and they definitely aren't static. API rate limits flex up or down based on the health of the overall platform and your own tenant's recent activity. One heavy day of provisioning or a major migration, and suddenly your integration is staring at throttling you've never seen before. Try searching the docs and you'll see Microsoft mentions throttling in passing, but most guidance is about try again later and moving on. The issue is when you just keep hammering the API after a failure, you're basically poking the bear. You make the throttling cycle worse, not better. That's because Graph uses dynamic limits, and if your code or flows ignore the headers returned with errors like retry after, you actually lengthen the block. Every failed call gets you throttled a bit longer. The naive approach is easy because, frankly, it's faster to code. But when one flow restarts every 2 minutes and 5 other automations retry on failure, your entire integration stack can grind to a halt. There's a right way to retry, and it's not just about waiting longer. Intelligent retry logic has a few non-negotiable traits. First up, exponential backoff. Rather than retrying right away or in fixed intervals, you increase the delay each time you fail. One miss means wait 5 seconds. Another miss, maybe double that. It sounds simple, but it cuts down on pressure while you recover. Second, respect the retry after header. When Graph tells you exactly how long to pause, you listen. That buys goodwill with the backend and avoids compounding blocks. And if you're processing lots of records, batch your calls. Lump together updates or reads so you're making fewer round trips. Microsoft has published guidance that says, in so many words, Limit parallel requests, keep batches small, and don't flood the API from multiple front ends at once. There's no shortage of cautionary tales. One team spent weeks building a workflow to pull status data from every SharePoint site in their tenant. The test run worked as expected. 3 weeks later, with the job scheduled to run overnight, they suddenly saw hundreds of Power Automate runs stuck in running status and a queue of failures stacking up. By morning, none of the automated reports had sent, and someone was buried in damage control. Reviewing the logs, the culprit stood out. Every time a call failed, their workflow retried on a tight loop with no backoff. The API just kept throttling harder, and the backlog ballooned. What could have been a minor blip turned into hours of lost productivity and angry users asking why no one got their update. Graph's own documentation tries to warn us limits aren't fixed. They flex based on tenant load and current system health. That means one bad spike can train the system to throttle you much sooner next time, especially if you aren't distributing your load or are running massive bulk jobs in business hours. When you factor in automated flows triggered by Teams membership spikes or big SharePoint exports, it's clear these limits aren't just an issue for custom apps. Power Platform automations fall into the same traps. As you start connecting everything with flows, each call to graph becomes a possible bottleneck. Multiple slowdowns add up faster than you'd expect. So how do you stay ahead? First, monitor your Graph API usage. There are scripts out there, many shared by the community, that let you pull request volumes, failure counts, and throttling events. Microsoft also offers some built-in monitoring, but you have to look for it. Set up alerts not just on failures, but on rising retry counts or long-run flows. If you start to see an uptick, you can retool your logic before the whole integration starts failing out. Second, audit your flows for retry behaviors. Make sure you're not just relying on the Power Automate defaults. They don't always follow best practices for exponential backoff or delay handling. Most environments simply let API health fly under the radar until it's too late. But by then, users are filing tickets and you're scrambling to recover. The difference between a resilient integration and a weekend crisis is smarter retry logic and just enough proactive monitoring to catch slowdowns before they affect the business. Once you get this tuned, those invisible walls stop being such a threat. So the big question, how do you actually bring all these prevention strategies together to create M365 solutions that can handle whatever limit shows up next? If you treat Microsoft 365 service limits like someone else's mess to clean up, you're going to stay in firefighting mode. The reality is most limits never announce themselves until you've got unhappy users and broken processes. A little systems thinking, really mapping out those dependencies, puts you in control instead of reacting to surprise outages. Make these tweaks while things are quiet. That's when you actually have space to fix what matters. If you want more lessons learned straight from the trenches, hit subscribe. And remember, in cloud environments, not knowing you're creeping up on a limit is the real risk.